Good morning, everyone. Let's go to Matthew 8 together, please. Matthew chapter 8. Well, this morning I confess I stand before you as a fool, because I am about to preach to you that the best news that I could ever tell you is in the form of the crucified Son of God. We who follow Jesus Christ claim that God has saved this world through his Son who was crucified. And yet, this news is foolishness to the world, folly to the wise. Why is it that a cross, a crucified Son of God, how could it be that that is the very substance of our gospel? Matthew chapter 8, we're going to begin in verse 14. And when Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick with a fever. He touched her hands, and the fever left her, and she rose and began to serve him. That evening, they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases. Now, this is one of 10 healing stories in Matthew chapter 8 through 10. In Matthew 5 through 7, Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount, and then after coming down from the mount, does 10 miracles. This miracle is in many ways the most important to the section because there's exceptionally important Old Testament quotation here. And yet, whenever we look at this, I think this small story raises questions that we need to think through. Look at Matthew chapter 8, verse 14. Now, when Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick with a fever. He touched her hand, and her fever left her. She rose and began to serve him. Now, Jesus goes to Peter's mother-in-law and heals her. And notice how he heals her. He touches her hand, and the fever leaves her. And then verse 16, that evening they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons. He cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick. Right after healing Peter's mother-in-law, Jesus then merely speaks, and demons leave those who are oppressed. Jesus touches Peter's mother-in-law. He speaks against the demons. She is healed. They are cured. And with a word, Jesus healed those who were sick. Now, Jesus came and he brought salvation and redemption and all of the good news that humanity could ever need. Whenever we notice what is going on in the Gospels, we do not need to read the Gospels as separate story to the more important part of Acts and the epistles. Rather, as N.T. Wright calls it, the Gospels are necessary preludes to what is going to happen in the crucifixion narratives. And I'm going to suggest that what we see in this section is actually foreshadowing and is going to help us make sense in what is going to happen at the crucifixion. Now, here's the question I would like to pose. If Jesus could heal Peter's mother-in-law and cast out demons by stretching out his hand and by speaking a word, why was it necessary for him to die? At that, why was it necessary for the Son of God to die the most humiliating, shameful, and painful way that a human could die? Through Roman crucifixion. Indeed, could God not merely have stretched out his hand from heaven? Could God not merely have spoken from heaven? You are forgiven? Wouldn't that be a much nicer gospel for us to tell people? God loves you, and God just speaks and you're forgiven. God just touched out from heaven and you're forgiven. That's not the gospel I preached to you this morning. The gospel I preached to you this morning is that the Son of God came to die. And yet, why was it necessary for the Son of God to die? As I said, I don't think that this story is separate from what goes on in the crucifixion, but is a necessary prelude to what's going to come. Notice with me Matthew 8, verse 17. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases. This, I think, could describe any of the miracles in Matthew 8 through 10. And yet, in this section, this was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases. This is a quotation from Isaiah chapter 53. Now, Isaiah 53, if I had to go around the room and ask which chapter of the Old Testament foreshadows the crucifixion, maybe you would say Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? You might say Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac. But I would venture to say number one on all of our lists would be Isaiah chapter 53. But we need to go back to Isaiah 53 and notice what is going on in that section to be able to understand the significance of the crucifixion. So go with me back to Isaiah chapter 53, please. Isaiah chapter 53. Isaiah chapter 53, I'm not going to read this whole section. I'm going to read a couple of sections from it. Isaiah chapter 53, I'm going to begin in verse 3. Isaiah chapter 53, beginning in verse 3. He, that is the servant, was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Now, I'm going to have to stop here for a moment. I'm reading from the ESV, and in most of your other translations in English, you're probably going to have a superscript above a couple of your words in verse 3. It's because there's all types of rabbinic discussion about how to translate these words. I want to just direct your attention real quick to the range of meaning to what's going on here. Above sorrows, the ESV says, or pains. Above grief, the ESV reads, or sickness. And I'm going to suggest to you that that is how Matthew read Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 is quoting, Matthew is quoting Isaiah 53 in the context of healing. The one who bore the illnesses, who healed the sicknesses. And whenever you read the text with this range of meaning, I think it adds whole new light into what's going on in Isaiah 53. Let me read it this way. Isaiah 53, verse 3. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of pains, acquainted with sickness. As one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised and we esteemed him not. The description of the servant is as one who is sick, as one who is ill, as one who is pained. And he has been covered by this sickness. One of the most horrible experiences in this life is watching a loved one turn into the sickness that they have. Whether it be cancer or skin diseases or what have you. Watching someone be overtaken by that sickness is painful. That's what's going on with the servant. The servant is taking on the form of one who is sick. He looks like one who is pained. Well, why is that? In Isaiah chapter 1, verse 4, Isaiah, I'm just going to quote it. Isaiah describes the nation of Israel. The heart is faint, the whole head is sick. In the book of Isaiah, Isaiah begins his oracle, Isaiah chapter 1, 4, and 5, by describing Israel as sick. The whole heart is faint, the whole head is sick. Much as Israel was sick, the servant is taking on the form of the people that he's among. The nation is sick, the servant looks sick. The nation has a heart that is faint, the servant is taking on the heart that is faint. The nation is pained, the servant becomes pained. Why is this? Verse 4. Surely he has borne our sicknesses and carried our pains. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. All we have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. What is the news of this passage? The servant is entering into a people that is sick. And in entering into a people that is sick, the servant is taking on the full form of the people. The people are pained, the people are sick, the people is ill. The servant will be the most pained, the most sick, the most ill. The servant is becoming like the people. And then you'll notice in verse 6, all we like sheep have gone astray, and we have turned every one to his own way. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all, is how the ESV reads. Now, the Greek translation of this text read it this way. The Lord has handed over to him the iniquity of us all. And I want to repeat this a couple of times. The Lord has handed over to him the iniquity of us all. The Lord has handed over to him the iniquity of us all. Two observations I'd like to make about this text before we go back to the New Testament. Number one, Isaiah 53 is about a servant who takes on the sickness of the people. And we saw in Matthew 8, that is how Matthew read Isaiah 53. It is about healing the sick, curing the ill. The nation is sick. The servant enters into a people that are sick. Observation number two, the servant is handed over to the sickness of the people. The servant again is handed over to the sickness of the people, and the sickness of the people is handed over to the servant. Likewise in verse 12, therefore I will divide him a portion with the many. He will divide the spoil with the strong, because he handed over, is how the Septuagint reads, he handed over his soul to death and was numbered with his transgressors, because he was handed over to the sins of many to make intercession for the transgressors. So keep this phrase in mind. Keep this phrase in mind. It is backward, Adam. I have to get that in my mind. The servant was handed over to the sickness of the people. I want to repeat this. The servant was handed over to the sickness of the people. Why? Let's go back to Matthew. This time, Matthew chapter 20. Matthew chapter 20. Early on in Matthew, Jesus gives vague allusions to his glorification. And yet in Matthew 20, he's coming out clearly explaining what will happen. Matthew 20, verse 17. And Jesus was going up to Jerusalem. And he took the 12 disciples aside. And on the way, he said to them, see, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over, or delivered, your translation may read, will be handed over to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified, and will be raised on the third day. Matthew describes the crucifixion of the Lord, where the Lord is handed over. While every book of the Bible is in harmony with how it tells about the crucifixion of the Lord, each book has a particular nuance. And in Matthew, the Son of God is handed over. The Son of God is handed over. Well, now let me go back to my question that I asked a few minutes ago. Why did God not merely say from heaven, you are forgiven? Why did God not merely reach out his hand from heaven and say, you are healed? Why did the Son of God have to come to earth and enter into the sufferings of this present age? Well, the Son of God was handed over. The Son of God was handed over. What does that mean? I'm going to use another Christmas song, Dempsey. Do y'all know the meaning of the song, Good King Wenceslas? I could sing it real easily, but I'm not going to. Good King Wenceslas looked down on the feast of Stephen when the snow lay round about, deep and Christian even. That song is about a king who is in his feast in a high castle. Whenever he sees a poor man come through the overwhelming snow without enough light to warm his home, the king leaves his feast, takes his page boy behind him, walks through the deep snow to carry fuel and food to the beggar that he may be warmed. The king leaves the comforts of his high castle to bring light and food to the one who was poor. The king left his comfortable castle to go through the deep snow to be with the beggar. The rich king took of his blessings and gave them to the one who was without. Who does that remind you of? Could good King Wenceslas not merely have said to the page boy, find fuel, find food, go to the man? Of course he could have. He's the king. But what does good King Wenceslas do? Good King Wenceslas leads the page boy down to the beggar. Why is that? Because good King Wenceslas enters in to the cold of the beggar, that the beggar may enter into the warmth of the king. The king enters into the darkness of the beggar, that the beggar may enter into the light of the king. The king enters into the poverty of the beggar, that the beggar may be touched by the blessings of the king. The king wants to enter in fully to the situation of the beggar so that he may fully understand the situation of the beggar, and the beggar may be blessed with the riches of the castle. What has the Son of God done? The Son of God has been handed over to a people that are sick. The Son of God has been handed over to a people that are sick with sin. Ever since Adam and Eve took in Genesis chapter 3, humanity has been plagued with the sickness of sin. And every last one of us have been overwhelmed with this sickness at some point in our life. May I suggest just very briefly to try to sort out a deep theological problem? I think whenever we conceive sin as sickness, it helps us to reconsider original sin in some way. Much as my father knew that he will likely develop hypertension as he gets older, he wasn't born with it. He was born with the symptoms, and he knew that as he gets older, he would develop it. But he wasn't born with hypertension. My children are not born sick, but I know that when they get older, they're going to get sick. And all of humanity has gotten sick with sin. And what has the Son of God done? The Son of God has not social distanced the plague of humanity. The Son of God came right into the midst of human sickness and was handed over to the utmost despair of humanity, that we as the beggars might be brought into the healing and the blessings of the King. Jesus Christ was handed over that we may be delivered. Jesus Christ was delivered over to sinners, that sinners may be delivered over to God. Jesus Christ entered into the world of sinners, that sinners may enter into the world of God. Jesus Christ did not stay comfortably up in heaven. Jesus Christ did not stay idle in the heavenly court, But the Son of God entered fully into the sickness of humanity that we may enter into the glory of God. Well, why has God done this? Why has God done this? As you work through Matthew, Matthew is going to use this phrase, handed over, to help us understand all of the different agents that are at work in the crucifixion. Go with me over to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26. Note, whenever your New Testament says delivered, this is the same Greek word for handed over. So I'm going to read it that way. Matthew 26, verse 1. Matthew chapter 26, verse 1. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be handed up to be crucified." Do you notice the verb there? This is passive voice. Passive voice. Active voice, I hit the ball. Passive voice, the ball was hit. This, the Son of Man, will be handed over. Who's doing the handed over? The Father is. And why does the Father hand over the Son to humanity? A maxim I think the Bible gives us is this: sin takes, but grace gives. Sin takes, but grace gives. Adam and Eve in Genesis 3:22 were cast out of the garden unless they take also of the tree of life. And what the sickness of sin does is make us selfish, where we continually take for ourselves. And whether it be glory, whether it be pleasure, whether it be satisfaction, sin continually drives us to take for ourselves. And yet, the cycle has been broken because the Father has handed over the Son as an act of grace. We did not have the antibodies. The Son of God would. We did not have the cure. The Son of God did. We did not have the salvation. The Son of God did. And so the Father handed over the Son to the sickness of humanity that we may be healed, that we may be saved, that we may be delivered. God gave over the Son as the greatest act of grace that we could ever conceive. And yet, the tragedy of humanity continues. Matthew chapter 26, and notice verse 45. Matthew chapter 26 and verse 45. This is in the context of the Garden of Gethsemane. Then Jesus came to the disciples and said to them, "Sleep and take rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is handed over to the hands of sinners." Why is the Son of Man handed over? The Father hands the Son over as an act of grace and faithfulness, welcoming us into his eternal flame of love. Humanity hands over the Lord from selfishness and taking. Judas, who will hand the Lord over to the rulers, hands him over from selfishness. Matthew 27, verse 1. Matthew 27, verse 1. When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. Not only has Judas handed over the Lord, but now the rulers hand the Lord over. And now they hand him over to Pilate. And you want to guess what Pilate does in verse 26? Then he released Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, handed him over to be crucified. Again, notice the context here. The Son of God is handed over. And in this phrase, we have, I went backward on this. There we go. In this phrase, we have the greatest theological statement about the crucifixion that we could make. Why did God not merely speak from heaven, you are forgiven? Why did the Father not merely reach out his hand and say, you are saved? The Son of God was handed over. The Son of God was handed over. And what does that statement mean? It means that the Father hands the Lord over to heal us. And praise be to God that Jesus Christ has come. And through him we can be healed. Through him we can be saved. Through him we can be delivered. But likewise, humanity has handed over the Lord to death. Jesus Christ demonstrates the full extent of human sin. Humanity was so sick with sin that they crucified the Son of God. Perhaps we could say it more accurately. Humanity is so sick with sin that we have crucified the Son of God. And yet in the handing over of the Lord, we can be healed. Sin demanded a solution. The sickness demanded a cure. We have been healed. Fleming Rutledge, in her book on the crucifixion, says this: the trajectory of the gospel story taken together with the horror of the crucifixion leads us to the conclusion that the hideous God-forsakenness of Christ's public execution corresponds to the soul-destroying nature of sin, and at its utmost reach, even as God renounces sin and executes final judgment upon it. Notice this: Jesus Christ has undergone our humanity in its completeness, all the way to the last extremity. He has become our representative human being. Perhaps we may say it this way: the Son of God has entered into the heart of human sickness, that we may be welcomed back into the heart of God. Let's notice how the Apostle Paul says this. Colossians chapter 1, verse 19. Colossians 1, verse 19. For in Jesus, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And through him, to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. The Son of God in heaven became the Son of Man on earth. The Son of God humiliated is the Son of Man exalted. Jesus has entered into our sickness that we may enter into his healing. The one who was in heaven came to earth that we here on earth may be welcomed back into heaven. Good King Wenceslas has not stayed in the castle. He has rather come to the cold. He has come to the dark and brought all of the blessings of heaven to bring light to the dark, to bring healing to the sick, to bring salvation to the condemned, that through him we can be reconciled back into the eternal love of God. And to that I say, to God be the glory. You can be preparing for the invitation at this time. Well, as I said at the beginning of my sermon, I still stand before you as a fool. The message I just preached to you is the embodiment of foolishness to this world. This world wants Jesus, the teacher, but rejects Jesus, the crucified Christ. And yet salvation comes not through the one who said nice things, but deliverance comes through the one who was crucified for us. And here is the good news that I would like to extend to you as an invitation. 5 things that God has done. The first is this: our God has created. Out of his eternal love, our God has created. And yet we rebelled. We got sick in our rebellion and turned against him. And because, number two, we rebelled, our Father did not remain static, but our Father has provided. The Son has sacrificed, and the Spirit regenerates. Because God has acted where we have failed. Because God has saved where we were helpless. Because God has delivered where we were lost. We cannot save ourselves. We cannot deliver ourselves, but we can accept and receive the salvation that God has given. When we hear the good news of Jesus Christ, good night. There we go. When we hear the good news of Jesus Christ, believe in Jesus as the Christ, the crucified and resurrected Christ. Repent unto righteousness. Confess our faithfulness to Jesus Christ and are immersed from death to life. God reconciles us back to him. If anyone needs to respond to the Lord's invitation this morning, I ask you come forward as we stand and as we sing.
The great physician now is near, has sympathizing Jesus. He speaks the drooping heart to cheer. Oh, hear the voice of Jesus. Sweetest note in seraph's song, sweetest name on mortal tongue, sweetest carol ever sung, Jesus, blessed Jesus. Your many sins are all forgiven. No, hear the voice of Jesus. Go on your way in peace to heaven and wear a crown with Jesus. Sweetest note in seraph's song, sweetest name on mortal tongue, sweetest carol ever sung, Jesus, blessed Jesus. All glory to the dying Lamb. I now believe in Jesus. I love the blessed Savior's name. I love the name of Jesus. Sweetest note in seraph's song, sweetest name on mortal tongue, sweetest carol ever sung, Jesus, blessed Jesus. And when to that bright world above we rise to see our Jesus, we'll sing around the throne of love, his name, the name of Jesus. Sweetest note in seraph's song, sweetest name on mortal tongue, sweetest carol ever sung, Jesus, blessed Jesus.
This morning we've heard the gospel, how that the Lord loves us, how that he took our sin, our sickness, took our place where we should have been condemned ourselves, and he took that place willingly there for us and saves us. Tonight